Welcome to this edition of the Head to Head Podcast. I'm your host, Cam McKinney, and this is episode number 149 of the podcast. And in this edition of the podcast, I'm talking about the relationship between the San Francisco 49ers and their starting quarterback, Jimmy Garoppolo. Earlier this week, it was announced that the Niners had traded up from the number 12 pick of the NFL draft all the way up to number 3, presumably to draft Jimmy Garoppolo's replacement. Yet, they are holding true to their stance that for the time being, Jimmy Garoppolo is their starting quarterback. And there's reasons for and against him being their starting quarterback. The reasons for: when he plays for the Niners in the 4 years he's been with the team, he is 24-8. He's been to the Super Bowl. He was within striking distance of beating Patrick Mahomes and the Kansas City Chiefs. The argument against: he has only thrown double-digit touchdowns in 1 year with the team, and that was the year he went to the Super Bowl. And another argument against him: he's only played in double-digit games 1 year, and that was that exact same year he went to the Super Bowl. So as much as a lot of people think very highly about Jimmy Garoppolo, right now, he's kind of a one-hit wonder. He's had one stellar year in the National Football League. The rest of his time, there have been flashes of him being really good, like when he played when Tom Brady was suspended, or when he first got to the Niners and he was undefeated, and then he got that massive contract, and then he had that 1 year that was really good. But since that year, he has been unreliable and he has barely played. Whether that's his fault or not, that is the reality of the situation. And we all know that the Niners have been in on some of the bigger name quarterbacks. I think they would have traded for Matthew Stafford if the asking price was right. I definitely think that they would trade for Deshaun Watson. I don't think that they're in love with Jimmy Garoppolo as their quarterback. I think they are afraid to move on from him if they get the wrong answer. Too many of these teams are afraid to move on from a starting quarterback. It's the reason why the Bengals never moved on from Andy Dalton. It's the reason the Bears held on to Jay Cutler for far too long. When you move on from your franchise quarterback, whether he's elite or not, teams get scared. That's what's happening right now. The Niners are afraid of their future without Garoppolo, even though they want a future without him. So it's super confusing for him, and I think it's super confusing for the team. And it's not like he's really bad either. He's thrown for 46 touchdowns and 26 interceptions in his time with the Niners, but he's not elite either. He's not a top 5 or top 10 guy, and there's no way he's worth over $25 million a year at this point, which he would make in each of the next 2 seasons. And so he's owed $50 million, but none of it is guaranteed. So it would make sense for the Niners to get rid of this guy, but I think the number one reason they're not is because they are afraid. And the other element of this story is the interest that the New England Patriots have in Jimmy Garoppolo. He was the backup there. He played a bit when Tom Brady was suspended, and everyone in New England seemingly wants Jimmy Garoppolo back, especially now that that team had a huge offseason. Fans think of Jimmy Garoppolo as icing on the cake. There are people out there that if the Patriots got Jimmy Garoppolo, they would look at them as legitimate Super Bowl contenders, and I'm somewhere in the middle of that. I feel like both of these franchises are overrating Jimmy Garoppolo. I don't think he's elite. I don't think he's a star Pro Bowl caliber guy. I don't think that highly of him. I think these two franchises are the only ones who think that highly of Jimmy Garoppolo. I think the rest of the NFL looks at him as a guy who had potential and hasn't lived up to it at this point. I think a lot of people think that the Niners went to the Super Bowl despite Jimmy Garoppolo, not because of. I think these two teams are arguing over a guy that the rest of the league does not look at as elite, because if he were elite, there would be teams that would be willing to trade multiple picks to get a starting caliber quarterback. Think about this. The Chicago Bears would rather go into the season with Andy Dalton than Jimmy Garoppolo. I mean, that's nuts. The Bears could offer something legitimate to get him easily, and they're not doing so. And while I said that New England fans are obsessed with Garoppolo going back to the Patriots, is Bill Belichick really going to make a serious offer for a guy who he traded away for a second round pick? And if you really look at the situation, Garoppolo is in the spot that Brady was when Garoppolo was drafted. Remember, Garoppolo was drafted while Tom Brady was still the starter of the Patriots, and then everyone thought that Brady's future with the team was now in serious doubt. Now, Jimmy Garoppolo, not being the best quarterback of all time, is in that same situation. Somebody is going to be drafted that everyone on planet Earth thinks is going to be his replacement. It's crazy how soon this has happened to him. I mean, Jimmy Garoppolo is 29 years old, and I think the most fascinating thing about Jimmy Garoppolo is what his future in the National Football League is going to be, because I think no matter where he ends up going, next year is going to determine his entire future in the league. If he has a huge bounce back season with the Niners or Patriots or whomever, then yes, you could look at Garoppolo and say that he could be a starting quarterback for the next 6 or 7 years. But if he has another injury-riddled year and the Niners give up on that contract or he gets released, then I think there's a real distinct possibility that Garoppolo becomes somebody's backup. And yes, even if he becomes a backup, there is a chance he could start somewhere down the line. But if Jimmy Garoppolo wants to make some serious money, he needs to put up serious stats next season, no matter who he's playing for. Because like I said earlier, I think around the league, he is viewed as a one-hit wonder, and he needs to have that second year that's stellar to prove that he's worth the big money. There's a reason nobody is trading for a guy who's owed $25 million. Yes, you could trade for him and restructure the contract, but I don't think that that's something Jimmy wants. I think that's something the Niners want to do with Jimmy. I'll get more into that in a moment. But yes, I don't think the rest of the league thinks very highly of Jimmy Garoppolo. Like I said, I think a lot of people think that he was just there for the ride of the Niners getting to that Super Bowl. But there are still people out there that think very highly of Jimmy Garoppolo. The problem is, I don't think those are the people who are running NFL organizations. I think he's just somebody that some people are obsessed with and won't get over. I also want to talk about that ridiculous press conference given by 49ers general manager John Lynch and their head coach Kyle Shanahan, where they all but said, we want to move on from Jimmy Garoppolo. Here's my sense of things. I think John Lynch is the one who really doesn't want to move on from Garoppolo because he wants to prove that he was right in making that trade. I mean, let's not forget, they gave Jimmy Garoppolo a boatload of money, and while they went to the Super Bowl, and some people will say that's enough, some people will view that as when you give a guy that kind of money, he needs to end up being an elite level quarterback, or you are dead wrong about him. I think in this equation, it's Shanahan who is the clear guy who wants to move on from Jimmy Garoppolo. This is a guy who's been proclaimed as an offensive genius, and right now he's coaching a guy who most people view as a system quarterback. Nobody views Jimmy Garoppolo as the guy who makes everyone better. They don't view him as Tom Brady. Tom Brady comes to the Bucs, and all of a sudden Scott Miller is putting up numbers and the Bucs are winning the Super Bowl. Jimmy Garoppolo is not that guy. When he was playing with that talent that were playing over their heads, he was able to get to a Super Bowl. Jimmy Garoppolo is a really good quarterback, but he is not elite. He does not make other players better, and I think Kyle Shanahan wants to coach a guy who can make other people's better, whether that's Zach Wilson, whether that's Trey Lance, whether that's Mac Jones, or whether that's Justin Fields. He wants to coach a guy who he can turn into an elite level passer, because Jimmy Garoppolo is not that. Let's remember what was happening that postseason. Ryan Tannehill was playing really bad and the Titans were winning despite him. And guess what? The same thing was happening with the Niners and Jimmy Garoppolo. Jimmy Garoppolo was not having a very good postseason, yet they went all the way to the Super Bowl and almost won the whole game. I think Shanahan thinks that the quarterback is the missing piece, that if he can get anyone who can play at elite level in those spots, who is not an impediment to the team, that Shanahan will end up winning the Super Bowl. Let me make this comparison. Remember Sean McVay and Jared Goff? I mean, Sean McVay got the best year out of Jared Goff. They went to the Super Bowl, they lost, and now Sean McVay is moving off of Jared Goff. It's exactly what's happening with the Niners with Shanahan and Garoppolo. These offensive geniuses, yes, they can get really good years out of guys like Goff or Garoppolo, but they want the elite level quarterbacks. Now Sean McVay has Matthew Stafford, and a lot of people feel better about where the Rams are going. I think Kyle Shanahan wants that same feeling with whoever his next quarterback is going to be. Yes, these guys can get elite level seasons out of some guys that are not top-notch talent, but I think Sean McVay knows he needs an elite quarterback to win the Super Bowl, and Kyle Shanahan knows the same thing. It is about the quarterback position. No matter how much of an offensive genius you are, you can only go so far with Jared Goff as your quarterback or Jimmy Garoppolo as your quarterback. If the Niners or Rams want to become dynasties, they need to get that next star guy. And maybe the Rams have that with Stafford. I don't know. It's possible that Stafford plays out of his mind. I think he's a way better talent than Jared Goff is. But for the Niners, they're going to draft that guy. I mean, both of those coaches must look at the situation that Andy Reid is in. Andy Reid is an offensive genius, but he wasn't winning Super Bowls with Donovan McNabb. He wasn't winning Super Bowls with Michael Vick. Do you know who he won a Super Bowl with? Patrick Mahomes. I think Shanahan wants his Patrick Mahomes. I think Sean McVay wants his Patrick Mahomes. I think these guys now know they can only go so far with mid-tier quarterbacks. They now need all-pro MVP caliber quarterbacks. Because when you get those kind of guys, they cover your flaws. I mean, just look at Russell Wilson with the Seahawks. We all look at the Seahawks and go, if he were not on that team, they would not even be a postseason contender at all. I also think that's a reason why Kyle Shanahan doesn't want to go out there and try to get Kirk Cousins at some point. I know he's been linked to that name. I don't think he wants a guy who is a Pro Bowl caliber guy but can't win the big games. Like, I think Kyle Shanahan now realizes he needs top tier quarterback talent, and if he believes in one of those guys who are the top quarterback draft prospects, then that's who he's going to pick. But this idea that Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch are going to draft a quarterback at number 3 overall and keep Jimmy Garoppolo to start over him for the beginning of the season, I think that's ridiculous. I think they are playing this weird game where they are trying to up the price for the New England Patriots. And at the end of the day, I think there's a chance that that's going to happen. But here's what I think is the absolute best scenario for both sides. If Kyle Shanahan really believes in this idea that a rookie should not be his starting quarterback to begin this season, then the best case scenario for the Niners and for Jimmy Garoppolo is for him to take a pay cut. He should be around the $12 to $15 million range for this year. Give him a 1-year deal. Get rid of that second year. Get rid of that $50 million. And I think that's a fair price. I would also put incentives in there so he can get a little extra. That's all about his playing time. Like, if Jimmy Garoppolo starts at least 12 games, I would give him the $20 million. I think he is good enough to be paid like that when he plays. I think Jimmy Garoppolo is arguably a top 12 quarterback. He's just outside of the top 10. He's nowhere near the top 5, but when he plays, the Niners win. That is a fact. 24-8 in 4 seasons with the team. That is an undeniable fact that the Niners, when they have Garoppolo, can win football games. When they don't, they can't. You might ask, why would that make sense for Jimmy Garoppolo? Because he would be still playing with elite level talent. You still have a star tight end that you can throw to. The Niners should still be a very good team with Garoppolo as their starter. Yes, your future might not be with the Niners, but like I said earlier, next year needs to be a great year for Jimmy Garoppolo. He needs to prove he's not a one-hit wonder, and I think that would be better for him to be on the Niners than it would be for the Patriots. All the big Patriot offseason acquisitions are good, but I think Jimmy Garoppolo would do better with the Niners. Kyle Shanahan, he knows the system. I think it would be the best case scenario for the team and for Jimmy Garoppolo to stay together for one more year, if they are serious about that. But the big if there is, why would you draft a guy to be your quarterback at the 3rd overall pick and have him sit a year? It just doesn't make much sense to me. But for the Niners and for Garoppolo, if you are willing to go through that, he needs to take a pay cut, 12 to 15 million. I mean, look, if he goes to the Patriots, he can throw to the star tight ends that they just got, Jonnu Smith and Hunter Henry. But you know what the weakness of the Patriots still is? They don't have star receivers. Yes, you can throw to Jacoby Myers, Nelson Aguilar's all right, Kendrick Bourne. They're fine players, but there are better options on the Niners. And another factor in all of this is think about the pressure that would be on Jimmy Garoppolo if he were traded back to the New England Patriots. I think there would be more pressure on him to go back to the Patriots than to be on the Niners. The Niners, you just have one more year, you ride it out, you try to have a good year. If it doesn't work, then you hit the reset button. If he goes to the Patriots, he will be looked at as the savior, and I don't think he's ready for that type of pressure because a lot of people wanted him to be the replacement for Tom Brady, and then they went through that terrible year with Cam Newton, and then enter Jimmy Garoppolo coming back, and now everyone has those expectations that you're going to the Super Bowl, that you're going to be the long-term answer at the position. I don't think that's the type of pressure that Jimmy Garoppolo wants on himself right now, especially with the fact that, like I said, this is a do-or-die year for Jimmy Garoppolo's career in the National Football League. He is 29 years old. He needs a massive year to prove that he's a long-term answer at the starting quarterback position. If next year goes wrong, he could be a backup for the foreseeable future and for the rest of his career. It is a massive, massive year for Jimmy Garoppolo. If I were him, I think I would rather be a San Francisco 49er than a New England Patriot because there are so many Patriot fans out there with these huge expectations. And again, if he doesn't work out there, it might blow up in his face in a huge, huge way. The media would turn that into a big thing. Oh, Jimmy G is here to save the New England Patriots. I don't think that's the type of heat that Jimmy G wants on himself right now, especially when he's coming off of this injury. I think if I were him, I would try to restructure that deal with the Niners and have one last year with the team. Now, from the team's point of view, I don't know why they would want to do that. My only reasoning is that Kyle Shanahan thinks this is still a very good 49ers team, and he wants to see if he can win one more time and try to get back to the Super Bowl with Jimmy G. But the most fascinating thing about all of this Jimmy G nonsense with the Niners and the Patriots is, like I said earlier, it only seems like these are the two teams that are obsessed with them. The other teams that have quarterback issues, the Saints, the Bears, the Raiders, they seem to want nothing to do with these guys. These two organizations are hung up on Jimmy Garoppolo, and at some point, they both need to move on from him because the likely truth is he's probably not the answer for the Niners, and he's probably not the answer for the Patriots long term. If you're going to have Jimmy G on your roster at all for both of those teams, he's going to be a short-term fix. If I were the 49ers, would I feel good with Jimmy Garoppolo as my starter going into next season? Yes. If I were the Patriots, would I feel a lot better with Jimmy G as my quarterback than Cam Newton? Absolutely. But you're trying to fix the issue for the long term, not the short term, and Jimmy Garoppolo is the definition of right now of a short-term fix. He's a guy who doesn't play in a lot of games. He's injury prone. He's had one season in the NFL when he's thrown for 20 touchdowns. And yes, that same year he went all the way to the Super Bowl. But I think right now he is a one-hit wonder who we overrate quite a bit. And all of this talk about Jimmy Garoppolo might lead both teams to nowhere. I guess in the end what I'm saying is Jimmy Garoppolo at this point is more of a myth than he is of a football player. You look at his career stats, they're not that mind-blowing. Yes, he's been to the Super Bowl and a lot of people feel vindicated because of that. But I think if you look at the ridiculous expectations that were put on him when he was traded to the Niners and then given that enormous contract, he hasn't quite lived up to those expectations. If you give somebody that kind of money, you expect him to be a top 5 or 10 guy who reliably plays 16 games and throws for at least 25 touchdowns. And that's just not Jimmy Garoppolo. Garoppolo has had one of the weirdest careers in NFL history. He's drafted the backup to the greatest quarterback of all time. We all think he's going to be Tom Brady's replacement. Then he gets traded for a second-round draft pick, gets a huge contract for the Niners after going undefeated in his first season, then goes to the Super Bowl, and we all think he's the next coming, and now he's an injury-prone guy that team says that they won't move on from, and that his old team is now obsessed with. Who knows where the career of Jimmy Garoppolo is going, because up until this point, he's had one of the most unpredictable careers in NFL history. Thanks for listening to this edition of the Head to Head Podcast. I'm Cam McKinney. There'll be a new episode of the podcast every Monday on Apple Podcasts and iTunes. So please rate, review, and subscribe.